Reception history, biblical studies, and the issue of multivalency. Reception history is a relatively new method in biblical studies, although it is clear that people have been interested in this approach, without giving it this name, for centuries. In brief, it focuses on the afterlives of a biblical text. It discovers a plethora of readings by looking at the use of a text not only through translations and the commentary tradition, but also through representations in liturgy, art, music, poetry, drama and film, as well as in political and social discourse. So this is not only about rereading a biblical text, it is about performing it, whether in liturgy or drama or film. It is about seeing it through many different modes of art, such as the early illustrated Gospels and Psalters, or in stained glass, woodcuts, oil on canvas and mosaics. It is about hearing it through music, whether in churches, concert halls, or more recently, synagogues. It is about understanding the layers of a biblical text through centuries of political and social discourse. In this way, there are multivalent trajectories. Reception history challenges to examine the hermeneutical assumptions that we, as modern readers, bring to any multifaceted biblical text. In the scholarly world, reception history has an important antecedent. This is the discipline of history of interpretation, and this can be traced back to Jewish and Christian exegesis as early as the 4th and 5th centuries CE. One seminal publication which chronicles this is Magnus Saibo's 3-volume work, Hebrew Bible Old Testament, The History of Its Interpretation, published as a complete set in 2021. Another is, more concisely, the Cambridge Companion to Biblical Interpretation, 1998, edited by John Barton. History of interpretation, however, is usually a word-centered approach, interested in the many ways in which Scripture has been read and used, and it usually advocates a determinative reading through this process. Reception history is also interested in the text and its traditions, but is equally more concerned with imaginative, non-verbal, and pragmatic approaches. Reception history is about biblical studies through many dimensions. In this case, scholars do not usually advocate one particular reading of the text over another, but rather expose the various hermeneutical constructs which readers through the centuries have brought to biblical texts. One key purpose is to demonstrate that one biblical text speaks with many different voices. So much for reception history. How do we understand the other term, biblical studies? There have been dramatic changes in this academic discipline over the last 50 or so years, and it is important to see how this has affected the way in which biblical studies interacts with reception history. In the 1960s, there was still some confidence about the assured results of what we call historical criticism, when it was assumed that we could know a good deal about the date, provenance, author, and purpose of most biblical texts. Historical criticism underwent continuous fragmentation in its approaches, and gradually it became less clear whether the biblical student should place primary importance on, for example, textual criticism, or source criticism, or form criticism, or redaction criticism. The historical critical approach seemed like some great archaeological dig with different levels of critical inquiry into the text, and it was difficult to know where to start first, and even more difficult to come up with assured results. Some 30 years later, a different approach became central to biblical studies. This was partly the result of questions asked of this discipline by feminist scholars, social scientists, and liberation theologians, and this actually had an enormous impact on the nascent discipline of reception history. This new approach, which overall might be named rhetorical studies, became a crucial way of asking different questions about the meaning of biblical texts. The emphasis moved away from looking at the text in context, or the world behind the text, to thinking of the reader in context, or the world in front of the text. Rhetorical studies gave rise to a whole range of other methodological approaches, and with it came a fresh understanding of the Bible as literature. not just ancient literature, but literature capable of being understood by many more contemporary literary techniques. The multiplication of these newer methodological approaches to biblical studies resulted in multivalent approaches to reading and interpreting the same text. Reception history, in my view, actually creates a bridge between the more traditional historically orientated approaches to the Bible, the world behind the text, and more literary approaches, the world beyond the text. So, I would argue that this term reception history requires two foci. First, it is about reception history. Secondly, it is about reception history. And so first, reception history. This approach is related to the more traditional historical critical concerns of biblical studies. Reception history, however, is concerned with many more levels in our historical understanding of the text than simply staying with the historical critical issues about the purported date, purpose, and author of a biblical text. Because it is interested in cultural history and in the influence of a particular text on many different cultures, it is as much as about a history of culture as about a history of the text. This is why it is very different from the history of biblical interpretation, as it is not an overview of the trends of cultural influences. Its concern is with the impact of a text within different cultural contexts. Nowhere is this exercise better expressed than in the Book of Psalms. The Psalter has been my focus of my own studies in reception history for years. I've written at length on the reception history of just Psalms 1 to 2, produced innumerable articles on the subject, and over 3 volumes, I've written a shorter reception history of every single psalm in the Psalter. Let me offer a brief account of why the Psalms are such an important text in this respect. First, the Psalter is the most cited and imitated book of Scripture. Without the Psalms, we would know far less about the cultural history of Judaism and Christianity, both in the East and the West. From the 7th century CE, when the Muslim faith also interacted with psalmody, the Psalter became one of the few biblical texts to have an interfaith appeal. Second, the Psalms also have a universal literary appeal. Think of their citations as early as Piers Plowman and the Canterbury Tales, or in the poetry of Philip and Mary Sidney, George Herbert, John Donne, and John Milton. Think of the number of psalms which have been performed in the concert hall as well as in the church and synagogue. Take, for example, Edward Elgar's adaptation of Newman's Dream of Gerontius, William Walter's Belshazzar's Feast, Igor Stravinsky's Symphony of Psalms, Leonard Bernstein's Chichester Psalms, and John Rutter's Psalm Fest. Collectively, they speak with a skilled poetic ambiguity about the goodness of creation, but also about the threat of chaos in the cosmos, about international and national affairs, but also about social injustice, intense suffering, and fear of death. The prominence of so many psalms in the funeral services of both the Duke of Edinburgh and Queen Elizabeth II testifies further to their universal appeal as cultural icons, embracing most aspects of what it means to be human and reach out to the numinous. No other biblical text has a reception history quite like the Book of Psalms. So in what follows from now on, I will use examples from the Book of Psalms. How do we do reception history? Some scholars apply the historical enterprise of reception by starting with the reception of a text in a particular cultural setting and working backwards to the early history of the text in its biblical setting. Other scholars work from the history of the text in its biblical setting forwards to the reception of the text in later cultural settings. I use this latter approach, and so my starting point is always the text of an individual psalm. I look first at a psalm in Hebrew, then assess the possible process of compilation of an individual psalm, and then to its inclusion within smaller collection of psalms, and so on to its inclusion within one of the 5 books which make up the entire Psalter, and I usually stay with the Hebrew Masoretic texts.